Chapter 1. The Murmur Beneath the Moss. The wind whispered low through the hedgerows that lined the perimeter of Elderbeck. This was not a town of great consequence. No railway line passed through it, and no traveller ever arrived unless they were meant to. The village sat modestly between fields that refused to yield anything of real profit, and hills that rolled like ancient sighs toward the crumbling edge of the moor. Yet Elderbeck had one claim to quiet fame, and that was the cemetery at its western edge. The cemetery, St. Eligius's Rest, was older than memory. The stones were not just engraved, but worn down by centuries of wind, rain, and sorrow, their surfaces etched with stories that had faded into moss and silence. Local folklore claimed that, when the moon was high and the earth was still, the stones murmured. Not with ghosts or voices from beyond, but with secrets, half-heard snatches of confession and forgotten truths, as though the earth remembered what men tried to bury. It was beneath such a pale moon that the body of Roland Hargrave was found. Hargrave had been a solicitor by trade, a man of unyielding posture and cautious words. His was the only home in Elderbeck with more than one story, a fact that had earned him as many enemies as admirers. Though outwardly respectable, Hargrave had a talent for knowing things, specifically things people would rather he didn't. This ability had grown his fortune and, some whispered, hastened his demise. The discovery was made by Elsie Mott, the young assistant to the village's undertaker, Mr. Aldwyn. She had gone early that morning to sweep the chapel and prepare the earth for a scheduled interment. What she found instead was Hargrave, stretched awkwardly across the steps of the ancient stone crypt at the heart of St. Eligius. His head was turned to the side, eyes half open, as though he had been listening for something at the very last moment. There was no sign of struggle, no wound, no blood. His death, the attending doctor would later say, was natural, perhaps sudden. A failing heart, maybe. Yet the stiff arch of his limbs and the unnatural tilt of his mouth suggested something stranger, something not quite right. By the afternoon, the village was murmuring louder than the gravestones. Mrs. Blanche Dulworthy, a widow of florid complexion and formidable gossiping skills, insisted it had been murder. "You do not simply die with that expression," she told the assembled company in the parlor of the Briar Inn. He looked as though he had seen something no man should see. Others whispered of curses, of ancient oaths broken. Hargrave had recently purchased the deeds to the cemetery's unused north plot, land that had lain untouched for generations. Some claimed it was consecrated too deeply to be disturbed. Others said it had never been consecrated at all. The matter might have remained a local curiosity, an odd death in an odd place. But for the letter. Inspector Maddox of the Elderbeck Constabulary had just begun compiling the standard reports when Miss Genevieve Hargrave, the late solicitor's niece, arrived from Bath. In her gloved hands she held a cream-colored envelope, addressed in a hand both delicate and commanding, to Monsieur Hercule Poirot, CO, Whitehaven Hotel, Bath. She had opened it, of course, a confession of sorts. Not of guilt, but of dread. Roland Hargrave had written that he feared he had stumbled across something buried but not dead, something which could not be laid to rest while truth lay chained. It was not a rambling letter, but there was a tremor in the writing, a mind unraveling in precise legal prose. Genevieve, pale and sharp-eyed, demanded the letter be sent immediately, not to the constable, not to the coroner, but to the only man she believed capable of hearing what the stones had to say. 2 days later, Hercule Poirot arrived in Elderbeck. He stepped off the hired motor from the city in his dove-grey suit, his shoes spotless despite the journey, and his moustache trimmed to near surgical perfection. Beside him stood a porter with an umbrella, a hat-box, and a small but heavy suitcase that Poirot personally oversaw with as much care as a bank vault. The villagers watched from behind hedges, curtains, and the open doors of the tea shop. Most had never seen a Belgian before, let alone one who appeared to walk as though the very ground should be honored by his feet. Poirot made no dramatic declaration. He did not announce a solution, or even a suspicion. He simply looked out across the low fields to the hump of mossy stones beyond the trees and murmured, "There is something here, something not quite symmetrical." As the motor car trundled toward Hargrave's house, now in the care of his niece, Poirot sat with his fingers templed. The letter had intrigued him, yes, but it was not dread that had drawn his attention, nor the idea of a cryptic murder amidst crypts. It was something else. Something in the structure of Hargrave's words. A man who dealt in clarity had written in paradox. A solicitor who specialized in contracts had hinted at curses, and beneath it all, a question had begun to form in Poirot's mind, one that would not let go. Why would a man of logic spend his final days listening for whispers among the dead? He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the wind of Elderbeck stir against the window pane. The murmuring had begun. Chapter 2. The Crypt and its Silence. The morning after Poirot's arrival brought a rain as fine as sifted flour, misty and persistent, coating the ancient stones of Elderbeck in a sheen that made everything glisten as though lacquered. The low sky hung close to the rooftops, muting colors and sound alike, lending the village the feel of something half forgotten. At 10:30, Poirot walked with Genevieve Hargrave across the sodden path that wound from the village green toward the graveyard. She moved with a kind of subdued energy, her pace brisk, her expression unreadable behind the veil of her wide-brimmed mourning hat. "Have you seen the crypt yourself, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked, voice cool and precise. "Non, mademoiselle," Poirot replied, glancing at the iron gate ahead. "Not yet. I preferred first to see the village, to understand its breath, its rhythm. But now we shall visit the scene of death. For the dead, they are eloquent if one listens closely." She said nothing, but her gloved fingers twitched slightly at her side. The cemetery opened before them like a theater frozen in the middle of some silent performance. The rows of tilted gravestones rose in haphazard lines, some nearly lost beneath ivy and long grass. Birds watched from the bare limbs of the cypress trees as though curious about these living intruders among their dead. The crypt itself stood at the center, aged and stooped, its entrance framed in heavy stonework worn smooth by the years. It had no door, only a low archway shadowed in dampness. Moss clung thick to its edges like green velvet, and the name carved into its lintel, Wyndham, was barely legible now. Poirot stood still before it, examining every inch of the structure with eyes that missed nothing. "You say your uncle was found here?" he asked softly. "Yes," said Genevieve. "Elsie found him just outside the threshold. The police marked the exact spot, but the rain has since washed the chalk away." Poirot took a careful step forward, avoiding the muddy impressions that still clung faintly to the earth. He turned slowly in place, eyes flicking from the stones around them to the half-worn steps leading into the crypt. "Did your uncle come here often?" Genevieve hesitated. I believe so. He took long walks nearly every evening after supper. He said it cleared his thoughts. I assumed he went to the river path or the woods. But the letter, it suggests he came here. Oui, to listen." "To what, Monsieur Poirot?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "There's nothing here but silence." Poirot did not answer at once. He knelt at the threshold, his polished shoes barely touching the moist ground. From the pocket of his coat he drew a small silver case, which he opened to reveal a set of collapsible measuring tools. He did not touch the stones, only measured their spacing, noted the slope of the entryway and the angle at which the crypt faced the village. Genevieve watched him, her brows drawn together in something like fear. "You think there was foul play, don't you?" Poirot straightened. "Mademoiselle, I think there is something incomplete about this scene. That does not mean murder, but your uncle's letter. It is a puzzle, and every puzzle must be examined for what is missing, not just what is present. They turned together and began the walk back, the path slick beneath their feet. As they approached the low stone wall that marked the boundary of the cemetery, a figure detached itself from the trees beyond. A tall man in a black overcoat, his face pale and angular, with eyes like slate. He doffed his cap politely as they neared. "Miss Hargrave? Monsieur Poirot? Forgive the intrusion." "Mr. Pendle," Genevieve said with a tight nod. "You startled us." "I meant no offense," said the man smoothly. "Only, I saw you heading to the graveyard. Thought it my duty to say, as a member of the parish council, that there are some in the village who'd prefer not to see outsiders stirring things up. The matter is considered, concluded." Poirot stepped forward, smiling gently. "And yet, monsieur, the truth is rarely so convenient, n'est-ce pas? You are Mr. Malcolm Pendle, I presume, the vicar's nephew?" "Yes, though I act in his stead now. My uncle's been unwell." "So I understand," said Poirot, still watching him carefully. "You were the last person to see Monsieur Hargrave alive, were you not?" Pendle blinked. Well, yes. We met that afternoon. He asked to examine some of the old burial records. I gave him access to the vestry archives." "And he said nothing unusual?" "No," Pendle replied slowly. "Only that he was verifying something. He seemed distracted." Poirot's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "But not fearful?" Pendle hesitated. "No, not fearful." Poirot bowed faintly. "Merci, monsieur." As the man walked away, Genevieve leaned closer. "Do you believe him?" Poirot smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Mademoiselle, I believe he spoke the truth, but whether he spoke all of it, that is quite another matter." They reached the main road where a faint smell of peat and chimney smoke hung in the air. "The stones did not speak today," Poirot said, almost to himself. "But perhaps they listened." And with that, he turned back toward the village, where more whispers, living ones, awaited his ear. Chapter 3. A Circle of the Living. The sitting room of Hargrave House was as austere as the man who had occupied it. Heavy velvet drapes filtered the pale afternoon light into dull streaks across oak-paneled walls. Books lined the shelves in perfect order, no sentimental volumes or signs of leisurely reading, but legal tomes, historical ledgers, and registers of land titles. A fireplace, though unlit, stood in solemn readiness, and above it hung a stern portrait of a younger Roland Hargrave, stiff-collared, eagle-eyed, and unsmiling. Poirot sat with his legs delicately crossed, eyes flitting between the faces before him. They had gathered at Genevieve's invitation, a request phrased as courteous, but clearly understood as a summons. The room held the 7 individuals closest to the late solicitor in his final weeks, each with their own reason for interest, their own shadows of motive. Genevieve stood by the hearth, her back straight, her expression a mask of civility. "Thank you all for coming. As you know, Monsieur Poirot is here at my request. I believe my uncle's death was not as simple as it appears." From the settee, a woman gave a small huff, dry, clipped, and unmistakably skeptical. "People die, my dear," said Mrs. Adela Marchwood, Hargrave's long-time neighbor and occasional bridge partner. She was nearing 60, dressed in conservative navy with a hat that had seen better decades. Especially men his age, with all that pressure on their shoulders. Poirot smiled politely. "Just so, madame, and yet sometimes the shoulders bear more than just business burdens." To her left sat Dr. Julian Feld, the village's physician. A man of scholarly bearing, his silver-framed spectacles caught the light with every glance. "The post-mortem revealed no anomalies, Monsieur Poirot," he offered with professional calm. "Heart failure. Plain and sudden." "Plain to the medical eye, perhaps," Poirot said gently. "But I'm curious what the heart may have feared." Feld folded his arms but said no more. Near the window stood a younger man with restless hands. Adam Colville, Hargrave's former assistant. In his late 20s, with a receding hairline and a nervous tic that made him rub his thumb against his knuckle when uncomfortable. He had been silent until now. "I only worked with Mr. Hargrave a short while," he said at last. "He was particular, demanding, but fair. I don't see who would wish him harm." Poirot turned to him. "Did he confide in you? About his visits to the cemetery, or matters outside of legal business?" "No, he was a private man. Though—" Colville's brow furrowed. "He did spend more time than usual reviewing old property cases, files from decades ago. He said there were anomalies." "Anomalies?" Poirot echoed. "Title discrepancies, unregistered parcels. He seemed preoccupied by something to do with St. Eligius." Genevieve glanced up sharply, but Poirot said nothing yet. Across from Colville sat a woman in soft lavender, Miss Clara Ainsworth. A pianist who had returned to Elderbeck to care for her aging mother, Clara had once been courted by Hargrave in their youth, or so the gossip claimed. Her voice, when it came, was precise, but not unfriendly. "Roland was a difficult man to love, but I don't think he ever meant harm. He kept his world ordered because he feared what chaos might bring. He told me once that the law was not for justice, but for structure." Poirot regarded her closely. "And structure, madame, can be upended by even one crooked stone." The final two guests had remained mostly silent. Malcolm Pendle, the vicar's nephew, lingered near the bookshelf, posture controlled, expression unreadable. He did not volunteer to comment, and Poirot did not prompt him. Yet. The last was Elsie Mott, the undertaker's assistant, whose presence had required some coaxing. She sat on the very edge of the smallest chair, hands clutched in her lap, a girl of perhaps 19 with pinched features and a nervous habit of glancing toward the door. I didn't touch him," she said suddenly, unprovoked. "When I found him, I ran for Mr. Aldwyn right away. He said not to speak of it to anyone but the police." Poirot's tone softened. "You did well, mademoiselle. But may I ask, what did you see?" Elsie swallowed. "He looked like he'd been listening. I know that sounds silly. But he wasn't just lying there. His head was tilted, like he was trying to hear something, like he was afraid of missing it." A brief silence followed. Poirot glanced around, gauging every reaction. Mrs. Marchwood scoffed. The imagination of the young. But Poirot leaned forward. "Non, madame, it is often the very young and the very old who see the truth first, because they do not yet, or no longer, dismiss what they observe." He stood, smoothing his jacket. "I thank you all for your candor, but allow me one final question." He turned to Clara Ainsworth. "Mademoiselle, did Mr. Hargrave speak of the North Plot? The unused ground of St. Eligius?" Clara's eyes narrowed. "Only once. He said he believed it was purchased long ago, and forgotten." Poirot nodded. "But the stones, they do not forget." No, they only wait to be read." With that, he bowed slightly to the room and turned to Genevieve. "I must examine the burial records, mademoiselle, and after that, perhaps speak with the undertaker himself." He paused at the door, then glanced back once more at the room full of shifting eyes. "Let us be clear," he said softly. "There is no such thing as a silent grave, only those who refuse to hear it speak." Chapter 4. Poirot walks among the dead. The undertaker's cottage stood at the far edge of Elderbeck, tucked just behind a hedge of blackthorn that bowed beneath the weight of years. The path leading to the cottage was narrow and neatly swept, with a faint aroma of camphor and beeswax clinging to the air. Hercule Poirot paused at the threshold, brushing a speck of dust from his lapel before knocking gently on the weathered blue door. It opened slowly to reveal Mr. Aldwin, a tall, stooped man with a solemn, quiet dignity and hands stained permanently pale from long acquaintance with embalming salts and grave soil. His eyes, though dull in colour, held a gentle alertness, as if accustomed to observing grief without intruding upon it. "Monsieur Poirot," he said without surprise, "I was told you might be coming." "You are most kind to receive me, monsieur," Poirot said with a polite nod. "I come with curiosity, not suspicion. A man is dead, and though the world says his heart stopped, I say only, why now?" Aldwin stepped aside to let him in. The cottage's front room was simple but immaculate, its walls lined with rows of brass fittings, ledgers, and shelf after shelf of tiny velvet pouches labelled in tidy ink. A grandfather clock ticked with funereal calm. "I have kept the records you requested," Aldwin said, handing over a thick cloth-bound ledger. "Burials, plot purchases, disinterments going back to 1847. Elderbeck doesn't change quickly." Poirot took the volume reverently and seated himself at the work table, carefully turning the stiff pages. Dates, names, numbers. Long dead children, entire families vanished in epidemics, soldiers returned home in boxes lined with medals. But then, as he reached the final quarter of the book, his fingertip paused. "Ah," he murmured, "but this is strange. The North Plot. Look here." Aldwin leaned over. The page listed a purchase made in 1883 by a man named Alaric Venn. 10 adjacent plots at the edge of the graveyard, noted as privately consecrated for Venn family lineage. No burials were recorded. And beside the entry, faintly scribbled in a different hand decades later, a curious note. Plots sealed by parish order, records retained by vicar's office. "Do you know of this, Monsieur Aldwin?" The undertaker frowned. "That's long before my time. I'd assumed those plots were unused, not forbidden. I've never seen anyone buried there, not in my 30 years. Poirot tapped the edge of the page. "Your impression, monsieur. Do the villagers avoid the North Plot, even today?" Aldwin hesitated. "They do. Even the children don't play there. It's as though the ground watches. I know it's only fancy, but it's how people feel. Your man Hargrave, though he was up there often these past weeks. Alone? Always. Sometimes with papers in hand. Once I saw him kneeling by one of the stones. No names carved, mind. Just slabs. He looked like he was arguing with them." Poirot closed the ledger gently. "Merci. One more question, if I may." "Yes? Who is Elsie Mott to you, a relative?" "No," said Aldwin, his expression unreadable. "An orphan. Grew up with the curate's wife before she died. I took her in when she was 15. She's clever and good-hearted, if a little skittish." Poirot nodded slowly. "Skittish, yes. As if she has learned to expect blows, but also perceptive. She sees what others discard." The old man offered a quiet smile. "That she does." Poirot rose, offered a courteous bow, and stepped out into the rain-softened afternoon. He did not return to Hargrave House immediately. Instead, he walked the long curve of the cemetery wall, following the outline of the North Plot. It was set apart not by fences or signage, but by nature itself. The grass grew thicker there, greener. The stones, blank-faced and squat, tilted in awkward angles as though resisting the earth's pull. A single tree, a hawthorn twisted into a hunchbacked silhouette, stood guard at the center. Poirot moved slowly, reading the ground as he might a man's face. Mud indentations here, broken ivy there. He crouched by one stone, inspecting a faint impression near its base. Not footsteps, something smaller, circular, almost like a cane, he murmured. The tip of a walking stick. Recently pressed, not yet washed away. He stood again, fingertips steepled, gazing at the stones. "Monsieur Hargrave," he whispered, What frightened you here? What truth lay beneath these markers that made your heart falter or be stopped? He heard the soft rustle of footsteps then and turned to see Clara Ainsworth approaching along the gravel path, her umbrella held low. "I thought I might find you here," she said gently. "This place, it pulls at the mind, doesn't it?" Poirot offered a thin smile. "Indeed, mademoiselle. Tell me, what do you know of Alaric Venn?" She blinked. "Venn? That's a name I haven't heard in years. My grandmother used to say he was a rich recluse who buried his family in secret and was never seen again. Is that story common in the village?" "No," Clara said slowly. "It's a child's tale now, half believed, half forgotten." Poirot looked once more at the crooked stones. "Ah," he said quietly. "But even children's tales begin with truth." As Clara's footsteps receded behind him, Poirot remained, standing alone among the murmuring stones. The wind picked up, and for a brief moment it did sound as if the graveyard was speaking. Softly, not in words, but in the rustle of grass, the shift of moss, the creak of the old hawthorn. Poirot inclined his head ever so slightly, as if listening, and then he turned back toward the village where the living continued to lie. Chapter 5. The assistant's fractured calm. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the grey hills, casting long amber shadows across Elderbeck's lanes. The village wore its usual hush, but Poirot felt the silence differently now, like a wall rather than a lull. People were watching, listening, and in that watchfulness there was unease. He returned not to Hargrave House, but to the smaller cottage just off the main road, the modest dwelling where Adam Colville lodged above the village grocer. A lantern burned low in the window, and the curtains had not yet been drawn. Poirot knocked twice, then waited. It was several moments before the door opened, revealing Colville with a startled expression and a half-buttoned collar. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, stepping aside awkwardly. "I wasn't expecting visitors." "Forgive the intrusion, monsieur, but often the best truths are found when people are caught slightly off guard, n'est-ce pas?" Colville gave a forced chuckle, then gestured toward the narrow table by the hearth. "Would you like to sit?" Poirot did, lowering himself into the wooden chair with precise care, his fingers resting lightly on the rim of his walking cane. "You were close to Monsieur Hargrave," he began gently. Colville nodded, but his mouth tightened. As close as one could be. He didn't exactly encourage familiarity. He kept his secrets. "Did he suspect someone was watching him?" Colville blinked. He was cautious, paranoid even, locked drawers, burned papers. Once I caught him tearing up a map of the cemetery, of all places. Said it was inaccurate. I didn't argue. Poirot's brow arched slightly. "And he never confided in you about his concerns?" "Only in fragments." Colville leaned forward. "He said he'd found an inconsistency in a burial license, something that tied back to a property dispute from the 1880s. He believed someone had covered up a transfer, perhaps even a crime. But when I pressed for details, he clammed up. He said I should mind the present, not resurrect the past." Poirot's gaze sharpened, and yet it was the past that led to his death. "Do you know what he meant by that?" Colville hesitated. "Only that he mentioned the Venn name. Said the land was never meant to be sold. He used that phrase more than once. Never meant to be sold." "Fascinating," Poirot murmured. "And did he quarrel with anyone recently?" "Not exactly a quarrel, but there was tension. Mr. Pendle, for instance. They disagreed over parish records, and there was a visitor, a woman once or twice, who came late in the evening. I never saw her face clearly." Poirot tilted his head. "A woman?" "Yes. Once I heard them arguing. Not loudly, but it was intense. I couldn't make out the words, just the tone." Poirot filed the detail away like a precious trinket. "Merci, monsieur. One more thing. Your impression of Miss Genevieve Hargrave?" Colville flushed slightly. She's efficient, reserved, but she loved her uncle in her own way, took care of his household, managed his schedule when he started forgetting appointments. Poirot's eyes narrowed. He was forgetful. Colville hesitated again. I shouldn't speak ill, but yes. For the last month or two. Odd lapses. He would ask the same question twice, lose his place in documents, but he always insisted he was fine, that his mind was clearer than ever. Poirot rose from his chair, adjusting his cuffs. Merci. Your honesty is of great value. As he turned to leave, Colville called after him. Do you think he was murdered? Poirot paused at the door, his silhouette framed in the dim hallway light. I think, he said slowly, that a man who dies alone in a graveyard while chasing shadows of the past is either mad or he is silenced, and Roland Hargrave was not a man who lost his voice without resistance. He departed without another word. As Poirot walked the dusk-dimmed path toward the village square, he caught movement in the corner of his vision, a figure crossing behind the chapel, quick, small, furtive. Elsie Mott. He changed course. She did not see him until he called softly, Mademoiselle. She jumped, dropping the small bundle she had been clutching to her chest. It rolled toward him and stopped at his feet, a faded book, its cover cracked and spine nearly gone. I'm sorry, she stammered. I didn't mean. I just wanted to return it. To the chapel. Poirot stooped and picked it up. The title was barely legible. The Lamentations of the Hidden Church. This belonged to Monsieur Hargrave? She nodded, eyes wide. He lent it to Mr. Pendle, then asked me to bring it back. Said no one else should see it. Poirot held her gaze for a long moment. Why do you think so? I don't know, she whispered, but it mentions the Venn family and something called the Stones of Oath. I didn't understand it, but it frightened me. Poirot's fingers closed around the book. You have done well, mademoiselle. He watched her retreat into the mist before turning the book gently in his hands. Secrets whispered from every corner of Elderbeck, and some, he suspected, were waiting to speak louder than even the murmuring stones. Chapter 6. Echoes in the Archives. The following morning arrived with a dense fog that smothered the rooftops of Elderbeck and pressed against the panes of Hargrave House like breath on glass. Poirot, already dressed and immaculate as ever, stood in the drawing-room with the cracked book laid open before him on a velvet footstool. He had spent much of the night leafing through the crumbling pages, which smelled faintly of mold and coal smoke, as if they remembered centuries of damp cellars. The Lamentations of the Hidden Church was not a theological work in the traditional sense. It was an account, half journal, half myth, of an obscure religious order that had once held influence in rural England, particularly in the far reaches of Yorkshire. The book was obsessed with burial rites, oaths made in blood, and the practice of placing witness stones over graves to ensure the dead could not rise in unrest. One passage had been underlined in pencil. He who moves the witness stones or speaks the sealed name aloud shall take the sin upon himself, and the stones shall murmur until the lie is buried anew. Poirot closed the volume slowly, his fingertips resting for a moment on the passage. He did not believe in curses, not in the theatrical sense, but he believed in symbols, in the weight they carried, in the psychological games they could inspire, and more importantly, he believed in the curious minds who used such symbols to cloak very human crimes. After a light breakfast of brioche and lemon tea, ordered through the hesitant housekeeper, Poirot set out for the vicarage. The old church, St. Eligius in Wood, stood just past the cemetery. Its stones weathered and lichen-covered, its bell tower leaning slightly as if worn by too many funerals. The adjoining vicarage, with its modest garden and shuttered windows, was presided over by the ailing Reverend Thomas Pendle, uncle to Malcolm. It was Malcolm who opened the door. He looked surprised to see Poirot. "You're early." but not unwelcome, I hope. Poirot offered his most winning smile. No, not at all. Malcolm hesitated, then stepped aside. My uncle is resting. You won't disturb him, but we must speak in the study. The study was lined with theological volumes and dusty journals. A few crumbling parish ledgers sat stacked on a side table. The room smelled of old paper and violets. Poirot gestured toward the ledgers. These, monsieur, are what I came to see. Malcolm gave a slight frown. I had hoped you would take my earlier counsel and let the matter rest. But you see, Poirot said as he took a seat, the matter itself does not rest. It murmurs still. With a reluctant sigh, Malcolm retrieved one of the older ledgers and opened it to a marked page. These are the original burial records for the North Plot. They do indeed list the Venn family as owners of the land, though only one burial is formally noted. Alaric Venn himself. No record of wife, child, or any other family member. After that, the entries cease. Poirot leaned forward. And why is that, do you think? Malcolm hesitated. There was a parish scandal. The details were never publicized, but according to my uncle's notes, Venn was accused of heresy, some unorthodox doctrine regarding burial and resurrection. His family distanced themselves, and the plot was closed quietly. Yet the stones remain. Yes, unmarked. My uncle once said that to carve names into them would wake the sin. I always assumed he was being poetic. Poirot examined the ledger closely. A faint smudge beside the Venn entry caught his attention. He removed a small magnifying glass from his coat and peered through it. The name of another had once been written beneath Alaric Venn's and later scratched out. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Someone wanted to be forgotten. Malcolm's voice lowered. That was my assumption as well. When Hargrave came here, he was obsessed with restoring that entry. He said the truth had been deliberately buried. And you resisted? I advised him against stirring old things. Some matters in Elderbeck are better left undisturbed. Poirot gave him a long, thoughtful look. Do you believe that, Mr. Pendle, or do you simply fear what they will uncover? Malcolm said nothing, but his jaw tightened. Poirot stood. One final question, monsieur. What is meant by the phrase, the stones of oath? Miss Mott found it in a book your uncle borrowed. Malcolm's eyes darkened. It's an old legend. Supposedly, the Venn family used those stones not just as grave markers, but as oaths, contracts of silence, secrecy, or atonement. The tale goes that each stone marked a sin confessed but never judged. Poirot allowed a moment of silence to pass, absorbing the weight of the claim. And those stones remain unbroken to this day. Malcolm nodded. Because no one dares test the story? Poirot bowed slightly. Merci, Monsieur Pendle. You have been most illuminating. He left the vicarage with the wind tugging at his coat and the fog still thick in the air. By the time he reached the chapel path again, the sun had begun to cut through the mist. The stones of the cemetery, mute and waiting, glimmered faintly under the light. He paused near the North Plot, watching as the mist pulled back, revealing more clearly the crooked markers that had watched generations pass. Murder, Poirot murmured to himself, is rarely an isolated act. It is an echo, and here, in this village of graves and shadows, the echo has only just begun. Chapter 7. The Man Who Would Not Sleep. That night, the wind returned with a shriller voice. It moaned between the eaves of Hargrave House and rattled the shutters like fingernails on old wood. Poirot sat in the upstairs study, the single candle on the desk casting long shadows across the walls as the flame fluttered with every gust outside. Before him lay 3 items: the Lamentations of the Hidden Church, the parish ledger from 1883, and Roland Hargrave's final letter, still folded and creased from its journey in Genevieve's trembling hands. Poirot read it again, not for the facts, but for the rhythm. The words were careful, the grammar immaculate, Yet beneath the surface was something brittle. Hargrave had been a man accustomed to certainty, and this letter was written by a man who had begun to doubt not the world, but himself. I believe I have uncovered something buried not only beneath stone, but beneath time. It listens. I fear I am being watched, not by a man, but by an idea I cannot name. The dead do not rest, Monsieur Poirot, because their story is not yet complete. I can feel it. The earth beneath my feet knows something. I am terrified that if I speak the name aloud, it will take me too. Poirot folded the letter again and tapped it gently against the table's edge. The knock at the front door came just before midnight. He descended the stairs quietly, expecting perhaps the housekeeper or Genevieve, but it was Adam Colville who stood in the entryway, his coat damp with rain, eyes red-rimmed from either drink or fear. "I need to speak with you," he said, barely above a whisper. Poirot nodded and stepped aside. "Come in. Sit if you can." They returned to the study. Colville stood rather than sat, moving to the window and peering through the curtains into the blackness beyond. "I've not slept," he said, "since the night I saw Hargrave in the cemetery. I've tried, but every time I close my eyes, I see his face. It wasn't just frightening, it was betrayed." Poirot remained still. "You did not mention this when we last spoke." "I didn't know how to say it. I saw him that night, just briefly. He was kneeling at the north plot, touching one of the stones with both hands. I should have gone to him, but I turned back. I thought he'd gone mad, or found something he shouldn't have." "What time was this?" "Just past 10. I'd taken a walk after supper. My window faces the path toward St. Eligius." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And did you see anyone else?" Colville hesitated. "Yes, that's why I've come. There was another figure in the mist, closer to the chapel. I didn't see their faces. But it wasn't Hargrave. Shorter, slighter, and watching." Poirot leaned forward. "A woman?" "I think so. The way she moved, she stepped back into the trees before I could be sure." Poirot stood and approached him slowly. "You have held this for days. Why reveal it now?" Colville turned to him, anguished. "Because someone left this in my room this morning." From his coat pocket, he withdrew a small object, wrapped in tissue. Poirot took it gently, unwrapping it with care. Inside was a smooth stone the size of a large plum. Its surface was flat, but faint markings, barely scratched, were visible. A symbol resembling a broken circle, with a single line slashing downward through it. Poirot stared for a long time. "Where was it?" "On my pillow." "And you did not hear anyone enter?" "No, but the latch on my window was open when I awoke." Poirot's mind raced. The symbol was not one he recognized immediately, but its intention was clear, a warning, a message meant not to terrify, but to unsettle. It was clever, almost surgical in its precision. "Have you shown this to anyone else?" Colville shook his head. "Only you." "Then you must stay quiet. Say nothing. I will speak with Miss Hargrave in the morning." Colville began to pace. "Do you think I'm being targeted?" Poirot considered this. "No. I think someone is warning you not to dig further, but you were never the one doing the digging, were you?" "Hargrave was, and now I am." He placed the stone on the desk with deliberate care. "Do you know what I think, Monsieur Colville?" Colville stopped pacing. "I think someone in this village is not trying to bury the past," Poirot said, "but to control how it is unearthed. And when someone like Hargrave gets too close to the truth, they do not kill in haste, they kill in strategy." Colville paled. "So you think he was murdered?" Poirot met his gaze without blinking. "I think Roland Hargrave was silenced, whether by poison, by fright, or by something even colder. Time will tell. But I promise you this, I will hear the truth, no matter how softly it is whispered." The clock on the mantel struck midnight. Colville left soon after, darting into the rain with one last glance over his shoulder. Poirot returned to the desk, staring at the stone again. The broken circle. The single line. It is not a signature, he thought. It is a severing. And somewhere in Elderbeck, someone had just declared that one truth must never come to light. Chapter 8. The Missing Name. By morning, the wind had abated, but the air remained damp and heavy with a tension that pressed against the village like a storm yet to arrive. Poirot, ever unruffled, sat at the breakfast table with a single boiled egg, perfectly sliced toast, and a teacup turned precisely to the right. His gaze, however, was far away, fixed not on the food, but on the broken circle stone now resting in a silk-lined box beside him. Genevieve Hargrave entered, her coat already buttoned, despite the hour. "I'm heading to the solicitor's office," she said quietly. "There are papers to settle. Leases. Pensions. He left no updated will." Poirot's brow lifted slightly. "No will? For a solicitor of precision?" "Outdated copies, yes, but nothing was signed within the last year. Nothing that accounts for his increased visits to the cemetery or the land he purchased. It's as if he was preparing for something but never got to finish it." Poirot stood. "Then, mademoiselle, I shall finish it for him." She looked at him, uncertain. "You think he knew who wanted to harm him?" "I think he was coming to know," Poirot replied. "And it is precisely when a man reaches the cusp of understanding that danger becomes urgent." He saw her out with a courteous bow, then made for the reading room. By 10 o'clock, he was already at the Elderbeck Municipal Archive, a humble stone building across from the post office, watched over by a sleepy clerk named Mrs. Harbottle, who viewed every request for public records as a personal inconvenience. "I'd like access to the property deeds," Poirot said gently, placing his card on the counter. "Particularly those concerning the cemetery land and any surrounding parcels, especially those transferred between 1880 and 1900. Mrs. Harbottle gave him a long look before turning, muttering and disappearing into the back. She returned with 2 thick volumes and a cardboard folder bound with twine. "Be quick. I've got a church choir coming at noon." Poirot settled into a narrow desk near the window, flipping carefully through the brittle pages. Names passed under his fingertips: land grants, boundary adjustments, sales from families long departed. Then he found it: Alaric Venn's purchase of the North Plot, 10 adjoining graves. Paid in full, granted by special arrangement. But a second document, folded and tucked loosely into the file, caught his attention. A transfer, dated 2 years later. Same plot, same dimensions. But this time, the owner listed was not Alaric Venn. The name had been blotted out. Not scratched or erased, but inked over, carefully, intentionally. So thoroughly that even the imprint of the pen was indistinguishable. Poirot's eyes narrowed. He held the page up to the light, trying to make sense of the shape beneath the black stain. Nothing. No visible clue. But a handwritten note at the bottom had not been blotted. It read, "All references to the second claimant sealed by parish discretion. Records withheld pending ecclesiastical inquiry." Poirot sat very still. 2 owners, one made public, the other is hidden. He turned to the final pages, scanning for any additional mentions. There was one, buried in a summary of contested land titles. See attached correspondence, R. Hargrave. 23rd February. Improper enclosure and burial without registration. There was no attached letter. Poirot replaced the files and thanked Mrs. Harbottle with a graceful smile. She grunted something about interfering Belgians as he left. As he walked back along the cobbled lane, he found himself thinking not of Roland Hargrave, but of the person whose name had been buried deeper than any grave. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure a single name did not appear in public records. Someone who had the authority, or the manipulation, to invoke parish discretion. Someone who had used the myth of the Venn stones as a smokescreen to obscure a legal truth. Back at Hargrave House, he made a call to a clerk in London, a contact from an old case, with a request to investigate ecclesiastical court proceedings from the 1880s in the Elderbeck region, especially anything involving contested burials or parish land grants. When he hung up, the housekeeper appeared in the doorway. Her voice cautious. "There's someone to see you, sir. She wouldn't give her name." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "A woman?" "Yes, sir. She said you'd understand if she said she came because the wind stopped whispering." Poirot straightened. "Ah, then show her in." The woman who entered was not what he expected. Late 30s, perhaps, with a face that had once been striking but was now worn from years of quiet fatigue. She wore a dark green shawl and gloves with mended fingers. "I saw you in the cemetery," she said without preamble. "You looked like a man who listens to things most choose not to hear." Poirot inclined his head. "You are the one Monsieur Colville saw that night?" She blinked. "So he told you?" "Yes. And I would now ask you to tell me, what were you doing near the crypt of St. Eligius? The night Roland Hargrave died?" The woman swallowed. "Watching him. I had to. He was getting too close." "Too close to what?" She took a deep breath. "To my father's name, the one your solicitor tried to unbury." Poirot said nothing. He waited. She stepped forward. "You won't find it in any record, but I'll give it to you now. My father was the second claimant to the North Plot. His name was Elias Pendle." Poirot's eyes lit ever so faintly. "And you," he said softly, "are the daughter who should never have been acknowledged." She nodded, trembling. "My father made an oath, and someone made sure he kept it." Poirot folded his hands slowly. The tapestry of the past was beginning to unroll, and in its weave lay a truth that had survived not because it was protected, but because it had been feared. Chapter 9. The Oath Beneath the Earth. The fire in the drawing-room burned low as dusk crawled once again across Elderbeck. Poirot sat before the hearth in careful stillness, the soft flicker of flame playing across his face. The woman, the unnamed daughter, stood across from him, her hands clutching the arms of the chair she refused to sit in. She had not yet given her own name. "You must understand," she said, voice thin and weary. "My father wasn't like the others. He wasn't ambitious. He wanted to live quietly. But there was a moment, a terrible moment, when he was asked to witness something and he agreed. And after that, nothing in our family was ever the same." Poirot's eyes remained fixed on her. "And this moment was connected to the Venn plot?" She nodded. "It happened before I was born. He never told me directly, only in fragments. When he drank, or when the wind outside got too loud. He said there were things in Elderbeck that had been forgotten for a reason. He said he helped bury something that was never supposed to be found again." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "What kind of something?" She shook her head. He never named it, only said it involved an oath, that he and another man, a solicitor, had sealed a contract, and that if it was ever broken, the village would know. Poirot tilted his head. "And this other man was Roland Hargrave's father?" "Yes, Charles Hargrave. He and my father signed something, an agreement, a silence pact. But something changed. The elder Hargrave died suddenly. My father grew quiet. My mother left him. And then, when I was 15, he tried to dig something up. Something in the North Plot." She looked down at her hands. "That's when the vicar stopped him. Reverend Thomas Pendle, my great-uncle. He told my father that breaking the pact would destroy what remained of his soul." Poirot's expression remained unreadable. "The Reverend intervened?" "Yes. He made sure the records disappeared. He called it an act of spiritual mercy. Said the dead had made their peace." Poirot sat back, fingers steepled. "And you, mademoiselle, you believe Roland Hargrave discovered this agreement?" "I know he did. He came to me 2 weeks before he died. Said he had found my father's name in the parish archives. Said he wanted to talk, but when I went to meet him, he never came." Poirot's voice was low. "Did he mention a name? A date? A document?" She nodded. "He said there was a final page missing, one that would prove what had been buried wasn't just a mistake. It was deliberate." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "And where is this page?" "I don't know." She hesitated, then added, "But I think he left it somewhere, for someone he trusted. Maybe Miss Hargrave, maybe your Mr. Colville." Poirot stood slowly. "You must come with me. Quietly. You're in danger now." "Because I know the name." "No," he said, reaching for his coat, "because someone else knows that you know it, and that person has already silenced one man to keep it hidden." By the time they reached Hargrave House, the fog had returned, rolling low over the garden and soaking the hedges in ghostly silence. Poirot ushered the woman inside and called for the housekeeper to prepare a guest room, but he gave no name, only that she was a friend in need of privacy. Then, without delay, he crossed the lane to Adam Colville's lodgings. The sky above was deepening into ink, and the first stars were barely beginning to pierce the haze. Colville answered on the second knock, eyes bloodshot and fingers ink-stained. He looked surprised, but not startled. "Is it about the stone?" he asked. "No," said Poirot, stepping inside. "It is about a piece of paper, a missing page, one that Roland Hargrave believed would settle a question the village has long refused to ask." Colville paled. "Aye, he told me about it. Said he wasn't sure who to trust, that if anything happened to him, I should find it." "Did he say where?" Colville reached for a satchel beneath the writing desk. From a hidden inner pocket, he pulled a folded sheet, yellowed and brittle, sealed with a waxy smear that once held a signet. Poirot unfolded it with delicate care. It was a contract, handwritten in looping script, dated 12th of June, 1885. "I, Charles Hargrave, solicitor of Elderbeck, do hereby confirm the internment of one Elias Pendle, bearing no ecclesiastical approval, within the grounds of the Venn estate. In witness and solemn pact, I vow to uphold silence, as does my co-signatory, Alaric Venn." Beneath the line, 2 signatures, Charles Hargrave and Alaric Venn. A third line had been drawn, but never signed. Poirot exhaled through his nose. Elias Pendle. Not the father, but the buried man, the hidden name. Colville looked stunned. "But that means—" "Yes," Poirot said softly. Roland Hargrave was not hunting a myth. He was hunting the truth behind his father's betrayal. The Hargrave name profited from the silence it helped impose. And now, someone seeks to ensure that silence continues. He folded the document again, returning it to Colville. "Keep it safe. Say nothing, and above all, do not trust a soul, unless I say so." Colville nodded, shaken. As Poirot stepped back into the damp Elderbeck night, a faint sound rose behind him. Not footsteps, not voices, but a distant, almost imperceptible shift, as though the earth itself had turned in its sleep. And in that whisper, Poirot knew. The final act had begun. Chapter 10. Shadows Behind the Glass. Dawn broke pale and uneasy over Elderbeck, casting a watery light across rooftops slick with dew. In the grey hush of early morning, Hercule Poirot stood once again in the north plot of St. Eligius Rest. The cemetery, still veiled in mist, stretched around him like a painting left to fade in the rain. But Poirot's attention was fixed on a single stone, flat, unmarked, and older than the others, its edges chiseled with subtle care. He knelt and placed one gloved hand atop it. "Elias Pendle," he said softly. A name erased from record, but not from consequence. From behind, soft footsteps approached. Poirot turned to see Malcolm Pendle standing just beyond the plot, dressed in a dark overcoat, his eyes sunken with weariness. The resemblance to the unnamed daughter was unmistakable now, the same sharp chin, the same guarded glance. "You're here early," Malcolm said. "As are you," Poirot replied. "Paying respects to a man you never knew." Pendle didn't answer. He stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the grave. "My father never spoke of Elias," he said at last. "Only that there was a breach in the family line, a darkness they chose to forget." Poirot rose to his feet. "But it was not forgotten, only buried, and when something is buried improperly, Monsieur Pendle, it seeps. Into memory, into blood, into guilt." Pendle's expression flickered. "Do you believe my uncle knew? Reverend Thomas Pendle? Mais oui. He was the last living witness to the contract's consequences. It is no coincidence the church records disappeared under his tenure. But the more pressing question is, who else knew?" Pendle crossed his arms, his tone sharpening. "Why does it matter now? Elias Pendle died over a century ago." "It matters," Poirot said firmly, "because someone in this village was willing to kill to keep his name secret." Pendle flinched. "You're certain it was murder?" Poirot nodded. "Too many threads have been snipped. Hargrave's unfinished will, the missing page, the tampered deeds, and the stone left on Mr. Colville's pillow. That was no idle warning. It was a message from someone who still believes in the oaths buried here." Pendle looked away. "And you think I'm that someone?" "I think," Poirot said carefully, "that you have lived your entire life in the shadow of silence, and perhaps now you must choose whether to remain in it." Later that morning, Poirot returned to Hargrave House and summoned Genevieve to the study. She entered with her usual composure, though her eyes betrayed a night of little rest. "You've spoken with the woman," she said, voice quiet. "The one who came last night?" Poirot nodded. "She is your cousin, by blood if not by law. Her father, Elias Pendle, was buried secretly in the Venn plot. Her grandfather, your own, was part of the pact that covered it up. Genevieve absorbed this without flinching. And you believe my uncle found out?" "I know he did. He attempted to undo it. But the cost of exposing such a truth was higher than he expected." She turned to the window, the morning light catching on the edge of her sleeve. "He always said the past was like rot beneath paint. Eventually, it eats through." Poirot watched her carefully. "Mademoiselle, do you know where he kept his private documents, those too sensitive for even his legal practice?" Genevieve hesitated. "He had a cabinet. Locked, in the cellar. Would you permit me to see it?" A brief nod. Poirot followed her down the narrow wooden stairs to the basement below Hargrave House. The cellar was clean, though heavy with the scent of dust and old stone. In the far corner stood a black iron cabinet, its surface worn smooth at the handle. Genevieve handed him the key from her coat pocket. "He never let anyone near it." Poirot opened the cabinet slowly. Inside were 3 bundles of letters, a velvet pouch containing 2 ornate keys, and a flat leather case. He opened the case carefully and found a folded parchment, different from the others. On it was written, in Hargrave's neat hand, "For the one who dares to listen." Below it, a final draft of a legal petition. It outlined the revocation of a sealed agreement between the Venn estate and Charles Hargrave. The grounds cited were moral dissonance, historical obscurity in violation of public trust, and mental anguish stemming from complicit silence. Signed, but never filed. Poirot held the parchment with reverence. "This," he murmured, "is the act of a man trying to make peace." Genevieve stood beside him now, looking down. He was trying to free himself from it, but someone got to him first. Poirot closed the cabinet, his thoughts racing. There were still too many questions, too many possibilities. But one thing was now certain. Roland Hargrave had not been digging into the past alone. Someone else had known, someone close enough to see each move before it was made. And now that Poirot had the proof, that someone would no longer remain in the shadows. Outside, a branch tapped softly against the cellar window, and Poirot knew the game was shifting, not just from past to present, but from secrets to survival. Chapter 11. The Trap of Half-Truths. It was nearing dusk again when Poirot made his way to the Briar Inn, the village's modest tavern. The air had turned sharp and brisk, the scent of chimney smoke mingling with the damp scent of earth. Inside, the inn was dimly lit and close with warmth, filled with the muted clatter of plates and the hushed murmurs of Elderbeck's more talkative residents. But when Poirot entered, all conversation dimmed to a murmur. He did not acknowledge the stares. Instead, he took a seat near the hearth, ordered a tisane, and waited. It did not take long. Mrs. Adela Marchwood, upright and vigilant, left her table near the window and approached, her coat draped like a cape over her thin shoulders. "You're wasting your time, Monsieur Poirot," she said flatly, seating herself without invitation. Roland Hargrave may have died in a graveyard, but that doesn't mean he was dragged there by ghosts. Poirot offered a polite smile. "No, madame, not ghosts, but perhaps the living who wear the dead like masks." Her expression tightened. "You think this is about the Venn plot? About those old stones?" "I do not think," Poirot said. "I observe. And I observed that you knew the Venn family. Once?" Marchwood stiffened. "That was long before my time. Yet you know the name. Everyone in Elderbeck does. We grew up with their stories. But you, madam, seem to fear something more than old stories. Perhaps because you have seen what others dismissed." A pause. She looked away, then leaned in. "There's something you must understand about this village," she said softly. "Elderbeck survives on forgetting. The Venn family was strange, reclusive. They brought strange rituals, buried their dead without a priest or sermon. When the last of them vanished, no one asked questions. But Hargrave, Roland, he began asking. Stirring. And someone wanted him to stop," Poirot finished. Her lips pressed together then. "He came to me last month. Said he'd uncovered proof the Venn plots were used unlawfully, that there were unmarked graves, and worse, that someone had covered it up." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And you did not go to the constable?" "I told him to leave it alone." She looked suddenly older, more brittle. "I told him the village didn't need truths dug up with bones. Yet here we are." She stood abruptly. "If you know what's good for you, Poirot, you'll leave Elderbeck before the earth gives up more than answers." Poirot watched her go, his expression unreadable. As he left the inn, the wind met him cold and quick. The sun had sunk below the hills, leaving the village in twilight hues of violet and blue. He returned to Hargrave House and found Genevieve in the sitting room, the fire barely lit, her hands folded over a thin ledger. "She came by," Genevieve said without looking up. "Mrs. Marchwood. She left this." Poirot took the book. It was a personal journal, Hargrave's. Not legal entries, but handwritten thoughts. The final pages were filled with obsessive lines. Sealed in silence. Not a burial, a bargain. She said the wind never stops. I hear them when I stand on the stones. Poirot turned the final page and found one line, scribbled in heavy ink. "They said the blood would bind us." I never agreed. He closed the book slowly, then turned to Genevieve. "I must ask you something delicate, mademoiselle." She looked at him warily. "Was your uncle ever involved in a ceremony? Something outside legal or religious bounds?" Genevieve's eyes narrowed. "You mean a ritual?" "I mean," Poirot said gently. A pact. Something that promised silence in exchange for benefit. Land, title, or protection. She hesitated. He never said so, but once, years ago, I overheard him arguing with the vicar. I was young, maybe 16. They were in the garden. My uncle shouted, "I never signed the second oath." And then he said something strange. Elias was the price. That was never part of the agreement. Poirot's brow furrowed deeply. 2 oaths. One public, one hidden. One binding, one resisted. Suddenly, the pieces began to rearrange in his mind. The erased name, the missing signature, the second line never filled. Charles Hargrave had signed. Alaric Venn had signed, but Elias Pendle had not. And Roland, haunted by that knowledge, had begun to hear what others pretended not to, the murmurs of a man whose death had never been consented to. Poirot stood. There is one place I must go. Alone. Genevieve rose too. Where? The vicarage. But the Reverend is too ill. Exactly. He reached for his coat. And I suspect he is the only one left who can tell me the truth before someone ensures that he never speaks again. Outside the night waited, still and sharpened. And in its hush, Poirot felt it, the breath before a confession. Or a death. Chapter 12. A name left unspoken. The vicarage was cloaked in near silence when Poirot arrived. The light above the entry flickered, the bulb dimming behind moth-thickened glass. Beyond the wooden door, the house was still, as if the rooms themselves held their breath. Poirot knocked only once. It was Malcolm Pendle who answered, his face taut with apprehension. His shirt collar was undone, and his eyes had the sunken look of a man who hadn't slept in days. "You've come," he said, voice hollow. "I told you I would," Poirot replied softly. Malcolm stepped aside to let him in. The air inside was heavy with the scent of lavender oil and old cloth, undercut by something subtler, mildew and dust, like pages long, left unopened. Poirot moved slowly through the hallway until they reached the door of the study. "He's awake," Malcolm murmured. "But not for long. Some days he doesn't speak at all." Poirot gave a quiet nod and stepped into the room. Reverend Thomas Pendle lay reclined in a high-backed chair by the hearth. A thick blanket covered his lap, and his hands, veined, mottled, and still, rested atop it. His head was tilted slightly, eyes open but unfocused, staring into the embers. Poirot approached gently. "Reverend Pendle." The old man did not respond. Poirot crouched so that their eyes were level. "I am Hercule Poirot. I believe you know the name Elias Pendle." A flicker. The Reverend's left hand shifted, just once, and then stilled again. Poirot pressed on. He was buried beneath the north plot, without sacrament, without record. "I believe you were there. I believe you saw the pact." The Reverend's lips parted, barely. Poirot leaned closer. "You do not have to speak aloud, only nod if I am correct." A faint motion of the chin, barely perceptible, but it was there. Poirot exhaled slowly. Was Elias Pendle murdered? The eyes closed. For several seconds, there was only the crackle of the hearth. Then, to Poirot's astonishment, the old man began to speak, dryly, rasping like wind through dead leaves. They said it was atonement. Poirot stayed absolutely still. They needed a witness, but the witness became the sacrifice. They said it had to be someone who understood the silence. Poirot's voice lowered. "Who were they, Reverend?" A pause. Then, "Charles and Alaric." "And you?" The Reverend gave the faintest shake of his head. I was young. I didn't know. I didn't know they would seal him in without prayer." Poirot's heart beat faster. Why was Elias chosen? The Reverend's eyes open now, cloudy but focused. Because he had heard. He knew what Alaric planned. And Charles? He was bound by his own father's debt. The land had already been promised. The pact ensured it stayed with the village, but Elias refused to sign. He said the land was cursed. Poirot's hands folded together. So they buried him, literally and legally. The Reverend gave a shuddering breath. I didn't stop. I couldn't. But I buried a Bible with him. It was all I could do. Poirot stood slowly. And Roland Hargrave, he found this out? A single nod. Did you warn him? The Reverend didn't answer. But the stillness that followed said more than any words could. Poirot stepped back. Merci, mon père. Rest now. You have spoken enough. As he turned to leave, the Reverend whispered one final word. Forgive. Poirot paused at the door. Forgiveness, he said softly, comes when truth walks in the light. Malcolm waited just outside, face pale. You heard? Poirot nodded. He confirmed what we both suspected. Elias was silenced not for what he did, but for what he refused to do. Malcolm closed his eyes. I didn't know. No, Poirot said gently, but someone else did. Someone who feared that your uncle's confession would come too soon. Someone who stood to lose more than reputation. Someone who feared the collapse of everything they had built upon that oath. Malcolm swallowed hard. Do you know who? Poirot gave him a steady look. Not yet, but I know how they think. I know how they fear. And that is enough to set the trap. As Poirot stepped out into the night, the wind caught the chapel bell, a single hollow chime rolling across the graves. A warning, or perhaps a call. The past had spoken. Now it was the living who would answer. Chapter 13. The Whisper That Was Not Heard. The next morning, Elderbeck felt colder than it had in weeks. Though the trees stood still and the skies were clear, there was a tension in the air, a quiet that was not peace, but pause. As if the entire village was holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable to surface. Poirot stood in the study of Hargrave House, reviewing the gathered documents once more. The forged land transfer, the burial records, the missing will, and now the old man's whispered confession, each piece pointing not to a ghost or a myth, but to something far more human. Guilt carefully disguised beneath ritual and stone. There was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Clara Ainsworth. I heard, she said without greeting, that you went to see the vicar. Poirot gestured her in. Indeed. And the Reverend, despite his frailty, spoke. Clara moved with her usual precision, settling into the armchair like a figure in a portrait. Did he name them? He confirmed what I already knew, Poirot said, that Elias Pendle was buried not as a man, but as a warning, a life entombed to preserve a lie. Clara's eyes flicked toward the window. I always suspected something was wrong with that ground. Poirot nodded slowly. Madame, you were close to Roland Hargrave, were you not? Closer than most. She hesitated. We understood one another. He was not easy to love, but he was loyal and curious. Did he ever tell you what he intended to do with the information he uncovered? Clara looked down. He said he would bring it into the light, that it didn't matter who was exposed. If the past was cruel, then it must be faced. Poirot studied her carefully. And you agreed? A pause. I feared it, she admitted. Because when you unearth one buried truth, you risk unsettling others. Poirot moved to the window, hands behind his back. I believe Hargrave intended to publish everything. He had prepared affidavits, petitioned for the cemetery land to be turned over to the Crown, and drafted letters implicating the parish, but someone intercepted him. He turned. And I must ask, Madame Ainsworth, where were you the night he died? She blinked. You suspect me? I suspect no one. I observe everyone. Clara's jaw tightened. I was at home with my mother. She's unwell, you know that. Poirot nodded. Indeed, but not incapable of being left for a few minutes. You think I crept to the graveyard in the night and frightened a man to death? No, Poirot said, his voice gentle but implacable. I think you knew he was going there. And I think you followed him. Clara's voice sharpened. To protect him. Or to stop him, Poirot said. To plead with him, to remind him that Elderbeck survives on what it chooses to forget. She rose now, stiff and trembling. I told him it would destroy people, that dragging up those names would bring nothing but shame. But I didn't kill him. Poirot remained still. Did he say he had the missing contract? Clara hesitated. He said he'd hidden it, in case someone came after him. Poirot stepped forward. Then you understand why I must ask. Did you return later? Did you remove anything from the chapel grounds? No, she whispered, but someone did. He watched her closely. Who? I don't know, but after he died, I went to the crypt. I saw footprints, 2 sets, one larger, one small. One of them must have been Hargrave's. The other, she trailed off. Poirot's mind raced. 2 sets of prints, one belonging to the victim, the other. Did you tell the police? He asked. I told no one, she said, because I was afraid, not of guilt, but of what the village would do if it knew who had walked beside him. Poirot studied her face, the lines around her eyes, the grief worn into the corners of her mouth. You know who it was, he said quietly. Clara swallowed, her voice almost inaudible. I suspect, but there's no proof. There never is, Poirot said, until the moment someone speaks the truth aloud. He stepped toward the hearth, where Hargrave's journal still lay. He opened it, turning once more to the last entry. They said the blood would bind us. I never agreed. Poirot traced the words with a fingertip. He was going to break the circle, he murmured. But someone stepped into it before he could. Clara said nothing. After a long moment, Poirot looked up. There will be a gathering tonight. One more. You will be there. Clara met his gaze. Is this the end, then? No, Poirot said. This is the beginning, the moment where silence finally has its answer. And as Clara left the study, Poirot remained, staring at the flickering hearth, listening not to what had been said, but to what had been withheld. Because in Elderbeck it was never the shout that gave truth away, it was the whisper that wasn't heard. Chapter 14. The Silence Before the Storm. The chapel bell rang once, just once, as dusk fell again over Elderbeck. The note hung in the air like an unanswered question, fading into the hush that draped the village like a veil. The wind was still, the clouds thick and unmoving. Even the crows that usually haunted the trees near St. Eligius had gone silent. Poirot stood at the edge of the cemetery path, dressed in his immaculate grey coat, gloves buttoned, hat slightly tilted. Behind him, the stones of the north plot sat like ancient jurors, their faces blank and waiting. He had summoned them all. Genevieve Hargrave arrived first, eyes guarded, her hands gloved and tightly clasped. Then came Adam Colville, pale and reluctant, shoulders hunched beneath a too thin coat. Clara Ainsworth followed, her face calm but unreadable. Elsie Mott came with her head lowered, clutching a notebook to her chest. Malcolm Pendle arrived last, his expression troubled, gaze flitting from stone to shadow. They stood in a loose semicircle before Poirot, the grass dewed beneath their feet, the earth beneath whispering with secrets. "Thank you for coming," Poirot began, his voice low but unwavering. "We stand now not for ceremony, but for clarity. Roland Hargrave died here, at this very spot, and though the world was told it was natural, we now know his death was anything but." A hush settled deeper over the group. Poirot turned slowly, surveying their faces. Hargrave died because he uncovered a truth buried too long. the story of Elias Pendle, who was silenced not by death alone, but by a pact of silence enforced by fear. Those who made that pact are gone, but those who benefited from it are not. Colville shifted uneasily. You think someone here, among us, was involved? Not in the act itself, Poirot said, but in the preservation of the lie, and more recently, in the act of stopping Hargrave before he could expose it. He reached into his coat and produced a folded page. This is a draft of Roland Hargrave's final petition. It names the land as falsely deeded, the burial as unlawful, and demands the return of the cemetery's north plot to Crown jurisdiction. He paused. Had it been filed, it would have triggered legal inquiries. Public attention, and someone in Elderbeck did not want that. Malcolm took a step forward. Are you accusing me? I accuse no one without evidence, Monsieur Pendle. But I observe, and I observed that your uncle, Reverend Thomas, was the last living guardian of that secret. He tried to confess, but he was watching, perhaps by you, perhaps by another. Clara's voice broke through the silence. Someone else was there the night Hargrave died. I saw the footprints, small, precise. Poirot turned toward Elsie, who flinched as all eyes fell on her. I didn't mean to, she whispered. Poirot's voice softened. Tell us, mademoiselle. She looked down at her notebook. I followed him. Mr. Hargrave, he'd been kind to me once. Gave me books when Mr. Aldwyn wasn't looking. Said I had a mind for seeing patterns. I thought he was in danger. I wanted to warn him. Genevieve stepped forward, voice sharp. You were there. I hid behind the crypt, Elsie said. I saw him kneeling. I saw someone else approach, but I couldn't see their face. Just their coat. Dark, long, like yours, Mr. Colville. Colville paled. That's absurd. Poirot raised a hand. No accusations yet. Let us consider the facts. Someone visited Hargrave in the graveyard. Someone he trusted. Someone who carried a knowledge of that final petition and knew where it was hidden. He turned toward Genevieve now. Mademoiselle, did your uncle ever leave instructions for what to do with his papers? She hesitated. Only that they weren't to be burned. He said the truth deserved a witness. Indeed, Poirot said. And now the witness is us. He stepped forward. I have one final observation. On the night of Hargrave's death, the gate to the north plot was unlocked. No sign of forced entry, no sign of resistance. That means the one who met him, perhaps frightened him, was someone with access, someone who did not need to force anything. A heavy pause. Poirot let it linger. Then, I know who was there. I know how Hargrave died, and I know why the silence was preserved, even if it meant another death. Gasps fluttered across the group. Genevieve's face was unreadable. Colville had gone pale. Malcolm Pendle was rigid. Clara Ainsworth's expression had become strangely serene, but Poirot said no more. Not yet. Instead, he stepped away from the group, turning back toward the stones. There is only one thing left, he said quietly, to call the silence to account. And behind him, the shadows stretched longer across the graves, awaiting like the living, the truth to rise. Chapter 15. The stones remember. The group dispersed in uneasy silence after Poirot's solemn declaration. No accusations had yet been spoken aloud, but the tremor left in his wake had shifted the air. Suspicion clung like mist between them, thickening every glance, every breath. The village, once content to slumber beneath its quiet myths, now stirred restlessly. The past was not merely whispering, it was remembering. That night, Poirot sat alone in Hargrave's study. The documents were spread once more across the desk, yet he barely glanced at them. Instead, he held a small envelope in his hand, one he had retrieved quietly from the Reverend's private drawer earlier that day. Inside was a photograph, its edges curling. It showed 3 men, Charles Hargrave, Alaric Venn, and a third, Elias Pendle. The three stood before the old chapel crypt, solemn-faced, their hands faintly dusted with soil. Behind them, just visible in the photograph's blur, a large stone slab marked with an unfamiliar symbol, half circle, half cross. The same symbol etched into the stone left on Adam Colville's pillow. Poirot set the photograph down with care. The message had always been clear. The secret must remain sealed. But it was not justice that had preserved it. It was fear, and fear, Poirot knew, was the most fertile soil in which murder could grow. He heard footsteps in the hallway. Genevieve. She paused in the doorway, hesitant. "You didn't say anything at the cemetery." "I said enough," Poirot replied without turning. "Now we must allow the silence to speak louder than our words." She stepped in, folding her arms across her chest. "I want to believe you'll find the truth. But what if it breaks everything?" Poirot finally looked up. "Mademoiselle, the truth does not break what is whole. It only reveals the cracks that were always there." She lowered her gaze, then placed something gently on the desk. "My uncle's watch," she said. "I found it behind a floorboard in the cellar. He must have hidden it." Poirot picked it up. It was a gold pocket watch, elegant and precise, the cover engraved with the initials CH. But it was the back that intrigued him. A fine scratch, almost unnoticeable, a circle bisected by a single line. "The same mark again," Poirot murmured. Genevieve frowned. He was obsessed with that symbol, drew it in his notebooks, muttered about it in his sleep. "It was not just a symbol," Poirot said softly. "It was a seal, a reminder of a pact, broken once and never forgiven." Genevieve's face paled. "And now," Poirot said, "the seal has been reopened, the silence disturbed, and someone has risked everything to keep it shut." She left him with a whisper of a nod. After she departed, Poirot took a lantern and returned, once more, to the cemetery. This time he walked slowly, deliberately, pausing with every step as though listening not to his surroundings, but to the ground itself. He knelt again at the north plot, in the same place where Hargrave had knelt, and he began to dig, not with a shovel, but with his hands. Gently, patiently. Only the topsoil, only enough to feel the shift beneath the moss. After a few minutes he struck something, a box, wooden, waterlogged, sealed with wax and wrapped in oilskin. He lifted it carefully and unwrapped it beneath the flickering light of the lantern. Inside, letters, dozens of them, each addressed to one of the three men in the photograph. Some unopened, some signed by a fourth name. Reverend Thomas Pendle. Confessions, debates, pleas. One caught Poirot's attention. It read, "Elias will not sign. He says the land is cursed by the memory of what came before. Charles believes a silent burial is mercy. I fear it is cowardice. I will not be part of this, but I have no choice. If this truth ever finds light, let it be known. Elias was not the villain. He was the conscience. The rest of us, shadows. Signed, Alaric Venn." Poirot's breath left him slowly. The men who had buried Elias Pendle had done so not with malice, but with fear. But someone after them, someone alive, had weaponized that fear. He stood, lantern in hand, and turned toward the village. It was time. Tomorrow he will gather them again, and this time the silence would not be allowed to leave unanswered. Because now the stones had spoken, and they remembered everything. Chapter 16. The truth beneath the morning came grey and low-hanging, as though the sky itself hesitated to lift. Thin mist crept over Elderbeck's rooftops, curling in the chimney stacks and collecting in hollows like breath held too long. But within Hargrave House, Hercule Poirot moved with quiet resolve. Today was the day of reckoning, not in the form of accusation, but revelation. The truth buried beneath fear and soil, was ready to rise. He summoned them again. Each had received a note written in Poirot's elegant hand, asking for their presence in the drawing-room at noon. No explanation, only time, only the weight of his signature beneath. When the hour struck, they came. Genevieve Hargrave entered first, her poise brittle as porcelain. Malcolm Pendle followed, solemn and composed, eyes flickering toward the others without settling. Adam Colville arrived moments later, jaw set tight, refusing to sit. Clara Ainsworth brought up the rear, silent and watchful. And finally, Elsie Mott, clutching her notebook, stood near the door as if prepared to flee at any moment. Poirot stood before the hearth, the box he had unearthed from the north plot resting on the table beside him. "Mes amis," he began, "I thank you for coming. I have called you here not for spectacle, but for peace. For Elderbeck has known no peace, not truly, since the day Elias Pendle was lowered into the ground, without right, without record, and without justice." The room held its breath. Poirot opened the box and withdrew a letter, holding it up for all to see. "This is one of many, written by Alaric Venn, hidden, sealed and buried beside the man they silenced. It speaks of guilt, of shame, and of a decision made not out of wickedness, but out of fear." He set it down and turned to them. But the guilt did not die with those men. It festered. It was inherited by blood and by silence, and when Roland Hargrave uncovered it, he paid the same price Elias Pendle did. He was silenced. Elsie let out a sharp breath. Genevieve's hand twitched slightly. Malcolm stared at the floor. But it was Clara who finally spoke. "You know who did it." Poirot inclined his head. "Oui, madame, I do." He moved to the table and lifted another item, a small, carefully folded piece of fabric. He unfolded it slowly, revealing the dark wool of a cloak. "This," Poirot said, "was found hidden behind the altar in the old chapel. Dried soil along the hem, moss along the lining, and in the pocket." He drew out a slip of paper, brittle with damp. Was a torn corner of Hargrave's final draft petition, the missing piece. Clara's eyes widened. "That proves nothing." "No," Poirot said, "but it speaks volumes. Because this cloak, hand-stitched with monogrammed threading, was tailored for you, Madame Ainsworth." Clara stood slowly. "You think I killed him?" "I think," Poirot said gently. "You went to him that night. You tried to stop him. You pleaded. But Hargrave would not relent, and something happened. Something sudden. Not a struggle, not a blow, but a fright. Perhaps you raised your voice. Perhaps he saw you with the cloak and believed in his superstitious state that the past had come to take him." Clara did not answer. Her eyes shimmered with a sheen of tears. "You did not kill him with your hands," Poirot said, "but you were there. You left him in the dark, and when he fell, you fled." Clara turned away. "I didn't mean for him to die." "I know," Poirot said softly. "But death does not ask for intention, only opportunity." A long silence followed. Then Genevieve stepped forward. "And the rest of us? Are we just spectators in this history?" "No, mademoiselle," Poirot said. "You are its inheritors. You, Malcolm, Adam, even young Elsie. You each carry fragments of this story. Some knew the truth and hid it. Others suspected and feared. And some, like Hargrave, tried to mend what was never theirs to break." He looked around the room. "But it is over now. The truth is spoken. The pact is undone. Elias Pendle is no longer forgotten. The land may rest." Malcolm's voice was hushed. "And the chapel? The north plot?" "It must be consecrated properly," Poirot said, "and open to history, not rumor, not fear." He turned once more to the hearth, where the photograph of the three men rested. "We are not made by the secrets we inherit," he said. but by how we choose to answer them. No one spoke, and in the stillness it seemed, for the first time in many years, the murmuring stones outside had grown quiet. Not because they were silenced, but because they had finally been heard. Chapter 17. The Circle, Unbroken. It rained that evening, not the harsh, wind-lashed downpour of storms, but a slow, cleansing rain, soft as breath, persistent as memory. The stones in the cemetery glistened beneath it, and the earth, so long hardened by secrets, seemed at last to yield. Poirot stood beneath the twisted hawthorn of the north plot, his umbrella a dark bloom above him. He had returned here not as an investigator, but as a witness. The circle of silence had broken, yes, but what remained must now be laid to rest with care. Behind him, Malcolm Pendle stood quietly, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders slightly bowed. "They're talking about rededicating the chapel," he said. "A full rite, proper consecration for the ground." Poirot nodded. "It is good. A ceremony is not merely a gesture. It is a release." Malcolm looked toward the crypt. "My uncle passed away that night," he said, "peacefully, before I could tell him the truth had come out." Poirot turned. His expression softened. He knew, perhaps not the details, but the soul often senses when the weight it carries begins to lift. They stood in silence a moment longer. Then Malcolm said, "And Clara?" "She has left Elderbeck," Poirot replied. "Her actions were rooted in fear, not cruelty. She bore witness to a truth she could not reconcile. But in trying to preserve dignity, she allowed death." Malcolm exhaled slowly. "There's more than one kind of guilt." "Indeed," Poirot said, "but also more than one path to forgiveness." They walked together toward the chapel. The wind whispered through the hedges, the rain stitching patterns into the gravel. Elsie Mott was waiting by the door, a lantern in hand. Her face was calm now, still young, still frightened in small ways, but steadier, stronger. "I've started writing it all down," she told Poirot. "Everything you uncovered, so people won't forget again." Poirot smiled gently. "That is a fine use of one's pen, mademoiselle. Stories, like stones, must be placed with care." As she moved ahead of them, Poirot paused one last time beside the entrance to the crypt. He placed a small folded letter, Hargrave's final petition, into the crevice of the stone. Not to ignite scandal, not to provoke shame, but to mark the place where silence ended, where the truth, long buried beneath oath and moss, had been returned to the light. And then, without a word, he followed the others inside. The chapel doors closed behind them, and the rain, gentle still, continued falling upon the graves, no longer as a veil, but as a benediction. Chapter 18. The detective's final word. Several days had passed since the gathering in Hargrave House, and Elderbeck had begun, cautiously, to breathe again. The wind through the trees no longer sounded like whispers, and the cemetery, once the heart of dread, had taken on a quiet stillness that spoke not of ghosts, but of memory. Poirot sat in the parlor of the Briar Inn, his bags neatly packed beside him, his coat folded just so over the back of a chair. A fire crackled in the hearth, its glow warm against the pale spring light that filtered through the windows. Across from him sat Genevieve Hargrave, her expression composed but softened in a way that had not been seen before. "They've begun repairs on the chapel," she said, stirring her tea without drinking, "and the Venn land will be given to the village trust, for gardens, perhaps, or a memorial." Poirot inclined his head. "It is a fitting use. Life growing from the place where silence once ruled." She studied him for a moment, then asked, "You never said it outright about Clara?" Poirot's eyes gleamed, but he remained still. "Because it was not necessary. The truth, mademoiselle, is a delicate thing. It must be revealed with care, not as a blade, but as a lantern. Clara Ainsworth did not kill Roland Hargrave, but she was there. She watched him collapse. She fled, out of guilt, out of fear, perhaps even grief. In that moment she became complicit, not in murder, but in cowardice. Genevieve lowered her gaze. She loved him in her own way. As did you, Poirot said gently, though differently, and quietly. She did not deny it. Poirot continued, but the one who watched the longest, the true guardian of this silence, was not Clara. He reached for the teapot and poured himself a small cup, his movements unhurried. It was the vicar, Reverend Thomas Pendle. He carried the knowledge of that grave for decades, and when Hargrave began digging, the old fear returned. But the Reverend, in his final hours, did not conceal. He confessed. Which means, Genevieve said slowly, that it wasn't the older generation who acted. It was someone younger. Poirot nodded. Oui. The stone left on Mr. Sy, Colville's pillow, the cloak left behind the altar, the tampering with the will, all signs of someone trying to mislead, to divert attention, but they lacked the finesse of true malice. They were, rather, the acts of a mind unraveling. Genevieve looked at him sharply. Elsie. Poirot's smile was wistful. No. Mademoiselle Mott, for all her fears, possesses a clarity few do. No, this was someone else. He reached into his pocket and placed a folded page on the table, a copy of the chapel guest registry. Only one name had been added in the weeks before Hargrave's death. Malcolm Pendle. Genevieve's eyes widened. Poirot continued, he did not kill Hargrave, but he followed him. He watched. Malcolm had grown up with the weight of silence all around him, passed down through blood and religion. When he saw Roland, an outsider to that weight, seeking to unravel it, he panicked. He confronted him, likely not with violence, but with fury, enough to shock the heart of a man already frayed by secrets. Genevieve whispered, and he never confessed. Because he does not think himself guilty, Poirot said. And in a sense, he is not. He acted out of a lifetime of inherited silence. The true crime, mademoiselle, was never a murder. It was the pact, the oath that said the truth must be buried if it proved inconvenient. Poirot stood now, smoothing the front of his waistcoat. Elder Beck is not unique in this. Many places carry the burden of silence, but few are given the chance to lay it down. Genevieve rose too. Will you come back? He gave a small bow. If ever the stones begin to murmur again. He took his hat, his cane, and his perfectly packed case, and stepped into the quiet street beyond the inn. The mist had lifted, the air was clean, and behind him the murmurs had stilled. As Poirot walked down the lane toward the waiting carriage, he allowed himself a final thought, not of crime or guilt, but of something deeper, that justice, in the end, was not always a punishment. Sometimes it was simply remembering a name too long left unspoken.